Welcome to the Health Talks podcast. Today, we're joined by our co-hosts, Mr. David Jones and Ms. Jessica Brown. Our today's topic is the human brain, a comprehensive guide to our most complex organ.
All right, get ready, because today we're diving deep into the most amazing thing, your brain. And lucky for us, we have this awesome guide to the human brain to help us on our journey.
We're talking about 86 billion neurons, all working together to make you.
86 billion, wow. That's like more than all the stars in the Milky Way, right?
Yeah.
So how does something that complex actually work?
Well, it's surprisingly organized. Like, think of your brain like a big city.
I like that.
Yeah, like a city with different districts that all have their own jobs to do, but they're all connected.
Okay, so what are these districts, like the main parts of the brain?
The one in charge, the big boss, is the cerebrum. It handles all the high-level thinking like language and decisions, even, like that brilliant idea you had in the shower this morning.
I did a brilliant idea this morning.
Maybe not, but you know what I mean. And it's divided into two hemispheres, left and right, each with 4 lobes.
4 lobes, so 8 total. That's a lot of brain real estate.
Yeah.
So if each lobe is like a specialist, which one is responsible for my interesting sense of humor?
That would be your frontal lobe, specifically the prefrontal cortex. It's where your personality and, your sense of humor comes from. But the frontal lobe is also in charge of tons of other things, like planning, decision-making, and even controlling your movements.
So if I'm trying to decide if I should have pizza again for dinner, that's my frontal lobe in action.
Exactly. And then right behind your frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, which is like a sensory processing center. It takes in information about touch, temperature, pain. Basically, it helps you understand your physical surroundings.
So like when I stub my toe, which happens way too often, that's my parietal lobe yelling, ouch!
Yep, that's the one.
Uh.
And then at the very back of your head, you've got the occipital lobe, the visual artist. It processes everything you see.
Oh, okay. So when I'm looking at a beautiful sunset, it's my occipital lobe hard at work.
Exactly. It takes the light that enters your eyes and turns it into those incredible images.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Okay, and below that we have...
The temporal lobe. It's known for its role in memory. It's like your brain's librarian, storing all your memories. It also helps you understand language.
So if I can still remember all the words to my favorite song from when I was a kid, I can thank my temporal lobe.
Absolutely. It's like a giant archive of everything you've experienced. And it also plays a big role in recognizing faces and objects.
So all those 4 lobes make up the cerebrum, right? What happens if one of them, gets damaged?
Well, it really depends on the severity of the damage and where it is. But the amazing thing is that the brain is so adaptable, other areas can often compensate. Like if there's damage to the occipital lobe, the brain might rewire itself so other parts can help with processing what you see.
Like a backup system.
Yeah.
So cool. We've covered the cerebrum, the big boss. What other important parts of the brain should we know about?
Well, next up is the cerebellum, which is located at the back of your brain. While the cerebrum is all about thinking, the cerebellum is all about action. It's responsible for making your movements smooth and coordinated.
So if I'm trying to learn a new dance move and keep tripping over my own feet, is that my cerebellum struggling?
Exactly. It's constantly fine-tuning your movements, making sure everything is balanced and precise. It's also essential for learning new motor skills.
Wow, so it's like the brain's dancer, making sure we don't fall flat on our faces. Okay, and the third key region.
The brainstem. It connects your brain to the spinal cord and basically keeps you alive. It controls breathing, heartbeat, sleep-wake cycles, all the important stuff you don't even think about.
So like the brain's infrastructure, huh? Keeping the lights on. So if the brainstem is damaged, that's pretty serious, right?
Yeah, it can be life-threatening. It controls so many vital functions. Luckily, it's well-protected, tucked away safely at the base of your skull.
Okay, cerebrum for thinking, cerebellum for moving, brainstem for keeping us alive. Are there any other important parts we should know about?
Oh, absolutely. There are a few others worth mentioning, like the thalamus, which is like a grand central station for sensory information. It directs everything to the right part of the brain.
Okay, so if I'm smelling those cookies baking, the thalamus is making sure that information gets to the right place.
Exactly. It also helps regulate sleep and wakefulness. And then there's the hypothalamus, which is kind of like the brain's internal control center. It manages things like hunger, thirst, body temperature, and even hormone release.
Wow, it's like the brain's thermostat, making sure everything is running smoothly. Now, what about emotions? Which part of the brain handles those?
That's the limbic system, is a whole network of structures involved in processing emotions, memories, and motivation. Like, for example, the amygdala plays a big role in fear.
Ah, so when I'm watching a scary movie and I jump, that's my amygdala in action.
Exactly. And the limbic system also includes the hippocampus, which is super important for forming new memories, and the cingulate cortex, which helps regulate emotions and attention.
It's amazing how all these parts work together. I mean, we're not even aware of it, but it's like this perfectly choreographed dance happening inside our heads.
That's a great way to put it. And all of this is thanks to those 86 billion neurons we talked about, that incredible communication network.
Okay, so we've got a good idea of the different parts of the brain. Now, let's zoom in on those tiny superstars, the neurons. What exactly are they doing in there?
They're the communicators of your brain. They constantly send messages all over your body, which allows you to do pretty much everything: think, feel, move, sense the world around you.
So how does this microscopic communication system actually work? Do neurons, like, talk directly to each other?
Actually, they don't touch. There's this tiny gap between them called a synapse. Imagine it like a busy intersection where messages are being passed back and forth.
So what happens at this neural intersection?
Well, when a signal reaches the end of one neuron, it releases these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. They're like tiny little packages of information.
So they're like the brain's postal service delivering messages.
Yeah, great analogy. They travel across that gap, the synapse, and bind to receptors on the next neuron, like a key fitting into a lock. And that triggers a new electrical signal to travel down the receiving neuron. And this all happens super fast. We're talking speeds up to 268 miles per hour.
Wow, that's faster than a race car. It's amazing to think that billions of these messages are zipping around our brains every second. So are all neurons the same, or are there different types?
Well, there are three main types, each with its own special job. We've got sensory neurons, which are the information gatherers. They bring information from the outside world to your brain. So like when you smell those cookies baking, it's your sensory neurons sending those signals to your brain.
Okay, so they bring the news from the outside world. What about the ones that tell our muscles what to do?
Those are motor neurons. They carry instructions from the brain to your muscles, telling them to contract or relax. So whether you're walking, talking, or just blinking, your motor neurons are at work.
Got it. So sensory neurons for input, motor neurons for output. What's the third type?
Those are the connectors, the inner neurons. They relay messages between sensory and motor neurons, and they connect different parts of the brain so everything can communicate and work together.
So they're like the brain's internal communication network, making sure all the different regions can talk to each other.
Exactly. They're super important for all kinds of things like learning, memory, decision-making, even emotional regulation.
Okay, so we've got our three types of neurons, sensory, motor, and interneurons, all sending messages at lightning speed. But what are they doing with all this information? What are the big functions of the brain?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. We've only just begun to explore the amazing things our brains can do.
You're right, we've only scratched the surface. Let's dive into some of those amazing brain functions like memory. How do we actually remember things?
Well, memory is a complicated process. It involves multiple brain regions and different types of memory. Like short-term memory is like a mental sticky note. It holds information briefly, like a phone number you just heard. Long-term memory, though, is more like a huge library, storing information for years, even decades.
But why do some memories stick with us forever while others disappear quickly? Like, I can still remember the lyrics to songs I loved as a kid, but I can't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday.
That's because memories are strengthened by emotions, repetition, and how meaningful they are. The more important an experience is to you, the more likely it is to be encoded into your long-term memory. And a big player in all of this is the hippocampus, a structure in the limbic system. It's like the brain's librarian, organizing and storing new memories.
Interesting. So if the hippocampus is damaged, does that mean you can't form new memories?
Yeah, that's right. Damage to the hippocampus can cause something called anterograde amnesia, which means you can't create new memories.
Wow, that must be incredibly difficult. But thankfully, the brain can be pretty adaptable, right? What about learning new things? How does that work?
Absolutely. Learning is another incredible function of the brain, and it happens through changes at the synapse, those tiny gaps between neurons. When we learn something new, the connections between neurons actually get stronger, so it's easier for signals to travel between them.
So the more we practice something, the stronger those connections become. Like, is that why riding a bike gets easier the more you do it?
Exactly. Repetition strengthens those neural pathways. And this ability to change and adapt, it's called neuroplasticity. And it's one of the most amazing things about the brain. It means we can keep learning and growing throughout our lives.
That's encouraging. Our brains are constantly evolving and rewriting themselves. Speaking of complex skills, how does our brain process language?
Language processing is a complex process. It involves a bunch of different brain regions working together. But two of the key players are Broca's area and Wernicke's area, both located in the left hemisphere of the cerebrum.
Okay, remind me which one does what again?
Broca's area is like your brain's speech center. It helps you form words and send the instructions to your muscles to actually speak. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is all about understanding language. It helps you grasp the meaning of words and sentences.
So if I'm trying to remember a word but just can't seem to find it, that's my Broca's area having a little trouble.
Exactly. And if you're having a hard time understanding what someone's saying to you, it could be an issue with Wernicke's area.
It's incredible how those two areas work together to let us communicate. But language isn't just about words, is it? What about the emotional side of things?
You're right. Emotions play a huge role in language, and that's where the limbic system comes in again. The amygdala, which processes emotions like fear and anger, can impact how we understand what others are saying and how we express ourselves.
So if I'm feeling stressed out, it might affect how I talk to other people.
Absolutely. Your emotional state can color how you speak and how you interpret what others are saying. And thankfully, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center, helps us regulate our emotions and choose our words wisely.
It's like the prefrontal cortex is the brain's diplomat, making sure our communication is smooth.
Okay, so we've covered memory, learning, and language. What about our other senses? How does the brain process all that information? Like the things we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch.
Well, each sense has its own special processing area in the brain. Visual information is processed in the occipital lobe, auditory information in the temporal lobe, and so on.
So when I'm listening to my favorite music, those sound waves are traveling to my ears and then being processed by my temporal lobe.
You got it. And if you're enjoying a delicious meal, that ear's taste buds sending signals to the gustatory cortex, which is also in the temporal lobe.
It's amazing how our brains can handle all of this information at once and create a whole picture of what's going on around us.
It really is. And we can't forget about motor control, our ability to move our bodies. Right. How does our brain coordinate all those complex movements?
The main control center for voluntary movement is the primary motor cortex, which is located in the frontal lobe. It sends signals down your spinal cord to your muscles, telling them to contract or relax.
So like when I decide to reach for a cookie, that's my motor cortex sending the instructions to my arm.
Exactly. The motor cortex works with the cerebellum, which we talked about earlier, to fine-tune movements and make sure they're smooth and coordinated. And the basal ganglia, which are deep inside the brain, help to select and start those movements, making sure everything happens in the right order.
It's incredible how the brain can manage all these functions so effortlessly. We don't even really think about it until something goes wrong.
True. But even when things do go wrong, the brain has this remarkable ability to adapt and sometimes even rewire itself to help restore lost function.
Speaking of adaptation, we've mentioned neuroplasticity a few times. Can you tell us more about this amazing ability of the brain to change and rewire itself?
Neuroplasticity is truly one of the most incredible things about the human brain. It's this constant state of change and adaptation, and it happens throughout our lives, not just in childhood like we used to think.
So it's not like our brains are set in stone after a certain age.
Nope, not at all. Neuroplasticity is happening all the time. It's what lets us learn new things, adjust to new situations, and even recover from injuries.
That's so hopeful. But let's rewind a bit. How do our brains develop in the first place? Like, where does it all begin?
It all starts even before we're born. During prenatal development, the brain is growing incredibly fast, forming the foundation for everything that's to come.
So in those 9 months, the basic blueprint of our brains is created.
Exactly. It's like this massive construction project with the neurons multiplying and moving to their designated spots, forming all the different parts of the brain we've been talking about.
It's mind-boggling to think about all that happening before we even take our first breath.
It really is. And it highlights how crucial it is for a developing brain to have a healthy prenatal environment. Things like nutrition, avoiding toxins, and managing stress levels can have a big impact.
Wow, I never realized how important those early months are. So what happens after we're born? Does the brain just keep growing?
It keeps growing and developing quickly through childhood and adolescence. One of the key things that happens during this time is synaptic pruning.
Synaptic pruning. That sounds kind of intense, like a major brain haircut.
It might sound that way, but it's actually essential for the brain to work efficiently. Imagine the brain is like a garden. Early on, there are way too many connections between neurons. It's overgrown. Synaptic pruning is like weeding out the overgrown paths to let the strongest connections thrive.
So it's about streamlining the brain's communication system.
Exactly. Getting rid of unused connections makes the brain more efficient. And this whole process is heavily influenced by our experiences. The connections we use a lot get stronger, and the ones we don't use fade away.
That makes sense. It's like the use it or lose it idea, but for our brains.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is why those early childhood experiences are so important. They literally shape the physical structure of the brain, which affects everything from our ability to learn to how we manage our emotions.
That's fascinating. It's like our childhood is literally shaping our brains.
Exactly. And adolescence is another crucial time for brain development, especially for the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, the executive control center. We've talked about how important it is for decision-making and emotional regulation.
Right, and that area keeps maturing throughout adolescence and even into early adulthood.
So that's why teenagers sometimes get a reputation for being impulsive. Their prefrontal cortex is still under construction.
That's a big part of it. The prefrontal cortex is still developing those abilities to control impulses, weigh risks and rewards, and plan for the future.
Good reminder that although teenage brains are capable of amazing things, they're still a work in progress.
Absolutely. But even in adulthood, our brains can still change and adapt thanks to neuroplasticity.
So what are some examples of neuroplasticity in action?
We see it all the time. Like when someone learns a new language, their brain physically changes, new connections form, and their brain becomes better at understanding and speaking the language.
That's incredible. So it's never too late to learn something new and actually rewire your brain.
Never too late. We also see neuroplasticity at work when people are recovering from brain injuries, like a stroke. Even if there's damage, the brain can sometimes reroute signals and shift functions to different areas, and we see amazing recoveries.
It's like the brain has this amazing built-in healing power.
It really does. It's a testament to its resilience and adaptability.
This whole conversation about neuroplasticity is so inspiring. It means we have more power over our brain health than we realize.
Exactly. Understanding neuroplasticity helps us make choices to support our brains, like doing mentally stimulating activities, getting enough sleep, and managing stress.
Okay, we've talked about the brain's amazing capacity for change and growth, but what happens when things go wrong? What are some of the problems the brain can face?
Unfortunately, there are a number of disorders that can affect the brain. Some are more common than others. Neurodegenerative disorders, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, involve a gradual loss of neurons, leading to problems with thinking, memory, and movement.
Those are the ones we hear about most often, right? In relation to memory loss and movement problems.
Yes, that's right. Alzheimer's disease, the most common cause of dementia, is marked by the buildup of abnormal protein deposits in the brain, which interfere with how neurons communicate and eventually lead to cell death.
And what about Parkinson's disease?
Parkinson's is caused by the loss of neurons in the substantia nigra, a part of the brain that produces dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in movement. So when it's depleted, it leads to tremors, stiff muscles, and slowed movements.
Those are just two examples, but it really shows how vulnerable our brains can be. Are there other types of brain disorders we should be aware of?
Definitely. Mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia all involve changes in brain chemistry and how neural circuits work.
So even though these conditions may not show up on a brain scan in the same way that a stroke might, they are still very real and based in the brain.
Absolutely. Mental health disorders are complex, but we're constantly learning more about what's happening in the brain with these conditions. And then we have traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs, which happen when the head experiences a sudden blow or jolt.
That can range from mild concussions to more severe injuries.
Right, exactly. The severity depends on the force of the impact and the part of the brain affected. And even a seemingly minor concussion can have long-term effects on how we think and feel.
It's a good reminder to protect our heads and see a doctor if we experience any head injury. And what about strokes? I know those can be very serious.
A stroke happens when there's a disruption in blood flow to the brain. This could be because of a blocked artery or a ruptured blood vessel. When brain cells don't get enough oxygen and nutrients, they can die, causing lasting damage.
The effects of a stroke can really vary, depending on what part of the brain is affected and how severe the damage is.
That's right. Some people might have paralysis or difficulty speaking, while others might struggle with memory or attention.
This has been a lot of information, but it's so important to understand the many ways our brains can be affected by injury and disease.
I agree. But while there are many challenges, there's also a lot of hope. Thanks to advancements in technology, we can really see inside the brain in a way we never could before. And this is leading to new treatments and interventions for a range of disorders.
Speaking of technology, let's talk about how it's being used to uncover the secrets of the brain. We've all heard of brain imaging techniques like MRI and fMRI. Can you explain how those work?
Brain imaging has completely changed our understanding of the brain. MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, uses strong magnets and radio waves to create really detailed pictures of the brain's structure. It's like taking a snapshot of the brain's anatomy.
So doctors can use it to see if there are any tumors or other abnormalities?
Exactly. And fMRI, which stands for functional MRI, takes it a step further. It shows brain activity in real time. It tracks blood flow to different areas of the brain, which tells us which parts are more active during specific tasks or thought processes.
So like, if I'm doing a math problem in my head, fMRI could show which parts of my brain are lighting up.
You got it. It's a powerful tool for understanding how different parts of the brain work together.
What about PET scans? I've heard those are used to look at brain activity too.
PET scans, or positron emission tomography, use a radioactive tracer to track metabolic activity in the brain. This can help diagnose conditions like Alzheimer's disease, which involves changes in how the brain uses energy.
So it's another way to visualize what's happening in the brain, but it focuses on metabolic processes instead of blood flow.
Exactly. And then we have EEG, or electroencephalography, which uses electrodes placed on the scalp to measure brain waves. It's a non-invasive way to look at brain activity, and it's commonly used for things like sleep studies and to diagnose seizure disorders.
Wow, all of these technologies are giving us an incredible look inside the brain. It's amazing how much progress has been made in understanding this incredibly complex organ. As we wrap up this deep dive, are there any key takeaways you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that your brain is incredibly adaptable and resilient. Even when there are challenges, it has this incredible ability to change and heal. Understanding how your brain works gives you the power to take better care of it.
That's a powerful message. What are some things our listeners can do to support their brain health?
So many things. Stay mentally active, learn something new, maybe a language or a musical instrument, get enough sleep, eat a healthy diet, exercise, and find healthy ways to manage stress. All of these things can benefit your brain.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've covered so much: the different parts of the brain, how it works, how it develops, some of the challenges it faces, and the incredible technologies that are helping us understand it all.
And there's still so much to learn. As we continue to explore the brain, who knows what amazing discoveries are waiting for us.
This deep dive has definitely made me want to keep learning. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And remember to keep those neurons firing.
Until next time, keep exploring the amazing world inside your head.
It really is. And don't forget about motor control, like our ability to move our bodies.
Right. How does the brain manage to make all those movements happen?
Well, the main control center for all your voluntary movements is the primary motor cortex. It's in the frontal lobe, and it sends signals down your spinal cord to your muscles, basically telling them what to do.
So when I decide I want to grab another one of those cookies, it's my motor cortex sending instructions to my arm to reach out and grab it.
Exactly. And the motor cortex works together with the cerebellum, remember the one that helps us with balance. Well, it makes sure all those movements are smooth and coordinated. Plus, we've got the basal ganglia deep inside the brain, which helps to select and initiate movements. They're like the organizers, making sure everything happens in the right sequence at the right time.
It's amazing how our brains handle all these functions without us even realizing it. It's not until something goes wrong that we really start to think about it.
That's true. And even when things do go wrong, the brain is pretty amazing. Sometimes it can adapt and even rewire itself to try and regain lost function.
That brings us back to neuroplasticity, this idea that the brain can change and rewire itself. Can you tell us more about that?
Neuroplasticity is seriously one of the coolest things about the brain. It's this ongoing process of change and adaptation, and it happens throughout our entire lives. We used to think brain development stopped in childhood, but we know now that's not the case.
So our brains aren't just fixed and unchanging after a certain age.
Nope, not at all. Neuroplasticity is always happening. It's the reason we can learn new things, adapt to new environments, and even recover from injuries.
That's so reassuring to know. But how do our brains develop in the first place? Like, where does it all start?
It all begins before we're even born.
Mm.
During prenatal development, the brain is forming at an incredible speed, setting the stage for everything that comes later.
So in those 9 months, the basic blueprint of our brains is formed.
Exactly. It's like a huge, complex construction project.
Yeah.
Neurons are multiplying like crazy and finding their designated spots, building all the different structures we've been talking about.
That's wild. All of that happening even before we take our first breath.
It is. And it shows just how important a healthy prenatal environment is for a developing brain. Things like nutrition, avoiding exposure to harmful substances, and even managing stress can have a huge impact.
Wow, I didn't realize how critical those early months are. So what happens after birth? Does the brain just keep growing bigger?
It keeps developing rapidly during childhood and through adolescence. One of the most important things that happens during this time is synaptic pruning.
Synaptic pruning. Okay, that sounds a little intense, like the brain is getting a serious haircut.
It might sound dramatic, but it's actually super important for the brain to function efficiently. Imagine your brain is like a wild, overgrown garden. Early on, there are tons of connections between neurons, but they're not all necessary. Synaptic pruning is like weeding out the overgrown paths so the strongest, most important connections can thrive.
Ah, so it's about streamlining the brain's communication system.
Exactly. By getting rid of those unused connections, the brain becomes more efficient. And this whole process is really shaped by our experiences. The connections we use frequently get stronger, and the ones we don't use as much, they sort of fade away.
That makes sense. It's like that saying, use it or lose it, but for our brains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how important early childhood experiences are.
Mm-hmm.
They actually shape the physical structure of our brains, which influences everything from how well we learn to how we manage our emotions.
That's fascinating. Our childhood experiences are literally shaping our brains.
That's right. And adolescence is another time of major brain development, especially for the prefrontal cortex.
Ah, yes. The prefrontal cortex, our brain's executive control center. We talked about how important it is for making decisions and regulating emotions.
Right. Well, that area is still maturing all through adolescence and even into early adulthood.
So that explains why teenagers are known for being a bit impulsive. Their prefrontal cortex is still under construction.
Yeah, that plays a big role. The prefrontal cortex is still developing its ability to control impulses, think about long-term consequences, and plan for the future.
Okay, good reminder that while teenage brains are capable of amazing things, they're still works in progress.
For sure. But the good news is, even in adulthood, our brains can still change and adapt because of neuroplasticity.
So what are some real-life examples of neuroplasticity in action?
Well, we see it all the time. For example, think about someone learning a new language. Their brain actually changes physically. New connections form, and their brain becomes more efficient at understanding and speaking the new language.
That's amazing. So you're never too old to pick up a new skill and actually change your brain.
Never too late.
Yeah.
We also see neuroplasticity at work when people are recovering from brain injuries, like strokes. Even with damage, the brain can try to reroute signals and shift functions to different areas. It can lead to some incredible recoveries.
So it's like the brain has its own incredible healing ability.
It really does. It's a testament to how resilient and adaptable it is.
This whole discussion about neuroplasticity is super encouraging. It means we have more control over our brain health than we might think.
Exactly. When you understand how neuroplasticity works, it can empower you to make choices that support your brain health, like choosing mentally stimulating activities, making sure you get enough sleep, and managing your stress levels. All these things can make a big difference.
Okay, we've talked about the brain's amazing capacity for growth and change. But what happens when things don't go as planned? What are some of the challenges our brains can face?
Unfortunately, there are a number of disorders that can affect the brain, some more common than others. Neurodegenerative diseases, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, involve the gradual loss of neurons and their connections. This can lead to decline in cognitive function and difficulty with movement.
Those are the conditions we often hear about, the ones associated with memory loss and difficulty moving.
Yeah, that's right. Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common cause of dementia, is characterized by the buildup of abnormal protein deposits in the brain. These deposits disrupt communication between neurons and can eventually cause those brain cells to die.
And what about Parkinson's disease? What causes that?
Parkinson's disease happens when there's a loss of neurons in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. These neurons produce dopamine, which is crucial for movement. So, as those neurons are lost, it can lead to tremors, muscle rigidity, and slowness of movement.
Those are just two examples, but it really highlights how delicate our brains can be. Are there other types of brain disorders to be aware of?
There are, for sure, like mental health conditions,
Hmm.
things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. They all involve changes in brain chemistry and how neural circuits function.
So even if those conditions don't show up on a brain scan like a stroke might, they're still rooted in the brain.
Absolutely. They're very real and very much related to what's going on in the brain. Mental health disorders are definitely complex, but researchers are making progress in understanding the brain mechanisms involved all the time. Then there are traumatic brain injuries, TDIs. Those are caused by a blow or jolt to the head.
Yeah, like concussions, right? Those can range from pretty mild to really severe.
Exactly. And how severe it is depends on the force of the impact and what part of the brain is affected. Even what seems like a mild concussion can have long-term effects on thinking and emotional well-being.
It's a reminder to always protect your head and see a doctor if you hit your head. What about strokes? I know those can be really serious.
They are. A stroke happens when the blood supply to the brain is interrupted. It could be a blocked artery or a ruptured blood vessel. Either way, brain cells are deprived of oxygen and nutrients, and they can die, causing lasting damage.
And the effects of a stroke can vary quite a bit, right? Depending on what part of the brain is affected and how severe the damage is.
Exactly. Some people experience paralysis or have trouble speaking, while others may have difficulties with memory or paying attention.
This has been a lot of information to process, but it's so important to understand the different ways our brains can be affected.
Definitely. And while these challenges are real, there's also a lot of hope. Technology is giving us amazing tools to look inside the brain, leading to new treatments and therapies for all sorts of conditions.
Speaking of technology, let's talk about those tools for a bit. We've all heard of brain imaging techniques like MRI and fMRI. Can you explain how those work?
Brain imaging has revolutionized how we study the brain. MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging, uses these powerful magnets and radio waves to create these really detailed images of the brain's structure. It's like getting a snapshot of your brain's anatomy.
So doctors can see things like tumors or other structural problems.
Exactly. And then there's fMRI, or functional MRI. It's even cooler because it shows brain activity in real time. It tracks blood flow to different areas of the brain so we can see which parts are more active when someone's doing certain tasks or just thinking about certain things.
So if I'm trying to solve a puzzle, fMRI could show which parts of my brain are lighting up.
That's exactly right. It's a really powerful tool for understanding how different parts of the brain work together to carry out those more complex functions.
What about PET scans? I've heard those are used to look at brain activity as well.
You're right. PET scans, or positron emission tomography, use a radioactive tracer to track metabolic activity in the brain. It can be really helpful for diagnosing certain conditions, like Alzheimer's disease, where there are changes in the way the brain uses energy.
So it's another way to see what's going on in the brain, but instead of blood flow, it focuses on those metabolic processes.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And then there's EEG, or electroencephalography. This one uses electrodes placed on the scalp to measure brain waves. It's a non-invasive way to monitor brain activity and is commonly used for sleep studies and to help diagnose seizure disorders.
Wow, all of these technologies are giving us such an amazing glimpse inside the brain. It's truly incredible how far we've come in understanding this incredibly complex organ. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that your brain is remarkably adaptable and resilient. Even when facing challenges, it has this amazing ability to change and heal. Understanding how your brain works empowers you to take better care of it.
I love that. So, as we learned, there are so many things you can do to support brain health. Engaging in mentally stimulating activities like learning a new language, playing music, or even just doing puzzles. Getting enough sleep, nourishing your body with a healthy diet, and getting regular exercise are all crucial too. And, of course, finding healthy ways to manage stress.
That's a great summary. And the amazing thing is, as we continue to uncover the mysteries of the brain, who knows what other incredible discoveries lie ahead?
That's what makes this all so exciting. There's so much we're still learning, and it feels like every new discovery opens up even more possibilities. This deep dive has definitely sparked my curiosity to learn more. Thanks for taking this journey with us. We hope you enjoyed it.
I did too. And remember, keep those neurons firing and those synapses snapping.
Until next time, folks, keep exploring that incredible world inside your head.